Before we get started, just have a little roundup of what's going on in the world of procurement. So, lots of intense activity leading up to and around implementation, and sort of thankfully, there's been a bit of a breather, I think, over the summer. But today, I think there's definitely a bit of a back to school feel. We're starting our new 5 in 25 academic year, looking again at the life cycle of a procurement, but this time trying to share with you our thoughts and observations of how things seem to actually be working out on the ground and what the sort of tricky points are. So a few things to be aware of in the procurement world, if you like. So the government's consultation on still further procurement law reform has just closed. Well done to anybody who managed to respond to that. And if you saw that, the consultation is around extra measures to support SMEs, support national capability, support high quality jobs and skills. And as well as that consultation, we have the commencement of some quite significant Procurement Act PPNs. So those are coming into play for central government authorities and indeed any other authority who opts to follow them. So from the 1st of September, new PPN 22 on steel came into force, and that does contain some new requirements, and those have been reflected in the Model Services Contract interim update that you might have seen was issued earlier this month to reflect those new obligations. And then 1st of October is quite a significant date. So we've got PPN 18 on prompt payment that comes into force, and that makes the standard slightly higher than it is at present. Very importantly, the new social value model comes into force. So that new social value model has been updated to reflect the updated National Procurement Policy Statement. And also we have PPN 21. So that's around conducting spot checks on how well the supply chain to central government and potentially other authorities is complying with the new 30-day payment terms requirements in the Act. So lots of new PPNs to think about. And then also just to note that the notice requirements in relation to prompt payments and contract performance, they didn't come into force on the 24th of February. And if you remember, they had a delayed implementation. And I think we're still waiting for confirmation of when they will actually come into force. And certainly there are no contract performance notices nor payments compliance notices on find a tender as yet. However, they're such a key part of the government's transparency regime and aims to extend the reach of procurement into the contract management phase. So we're sure that the government will want to get those live as soon as possible. So that's again something else to look out for, possibly sometime in the autumn. So that's a bit of a roundup. So let's begin with our questions at the beginning, pre-procurement considerations, and Dominic is going to talk to us about planned procurement notices, their uses and their limitations. Thank you, Dom.
Thanks, Jenny. Good morning, everyone. Yep, so planned procurement notices and what they're used for and what the limitations. So worth just a quick refresh on what are the three notices required in the pre-procurement phase. Obviously, you have your pipeline notices, which are mandatory. We'll touch on later in today's session. Preliminary market engagement notices, which we'll also touch on. And then planned procurement notices, which are entirely discretionary, and it's up to the authority whether they want to use them. So what are they? Well, they're very much a successor to the old PIN notices, which you may remember from the old PCRs, UCRs, etc. And they're defined under Section 15.2 of the Act as being a notice which sets out that a contracting authority intends to publish a tender notice, and it contains information which is required under the regulations. So this is the type of things such as estimated date of the tender notice, expected procedure, is it going to be an open procedure, compatible flex, and such information as would be required for a tender notice. So, for example, what is your requirement? What are you wanting to procure? Now, unlike the old PN notices, which in some instances, say under the utilities contracts regs, could be used for a call for competition, this has not made its way into the Procurement Act. You can't use the PPN to have a call for competition. So what are the benefits? Well, first, there's just that general benefit of warming up the market, letting them know that procurement opportunity is coming, and they should start to prepare, whether that's internal preparation, talking to their supply chain, maybe even talk to each other, maybe forming some JVs. Secondly, and probably more interestingly, is this idea of using them to reduce your tender timescales. Now, Section 15.3 sets out a definition for a qualifying planned procurement notice. Quite simply, it's a planned procurement notice that is published at least 40 days, but no more than 12 months before the day in which the tender notice is published. Provided your PPN is published within those timescales and it satisfies the requirements of Section 15.2 in the regulations, it will be a qualifying planned procurement notice, and you can potentially use it to reduce your tender period. Next slide, please, Jenny. So what are the reductions? Well, if it is a qualifying PPN, you can reduce your tender period down to 10 days. Potentially that's a saving of 15 days, or in some instances, maybe even 25 days. Now, it's worth noting here that this applies simply to that tender period. If you have a participation period, say you've designed your procurement procedure so it's similar to the old restricted procedure, so that sort of selection period point, you can't use them to reduce that period, but you can for the tender period. So it can be really helpful if a contracting authority has a tight program and for some reason there's some slippage around getting that tender notice out. Possibly there needs to be internal sign-off. So you've got the information, but you just can't get it through. If you publish this planned procurement notice in accordance with the qualifying planned procurement notice requirements, you could try and capture some time there during that tender period and try and make up that program. So that's the theory, at least. In practice, how useful are they? Well, there's potentially some constraints. So say you published a PPM, and then when it came to the tender notice, your requirement changed. You probably wouldn't be able to rely on that reduction to that tender period. Government guidance gives an example of a contracting authority going out under its PPN, saying that they're going to procure some photocopiers. Then when it actually comes to the tender notice, they switch to computers. You probably couldn't rely on it then. Another example, if in your PPN you say we're going to publish a tender notice in, say, 6 months' time, but you actually publish it within 2 months' time, it would probably be difficult to argue you can rely on that reduction in that tender period, simply because the suppliers have not had that 4 months to help prepare their tenders. And of course, there's just the general obligations, Section 12 of the Act, and specifically Section 54 of the Act, which says when authorities are developing these tender periods, they need to have regard to things such as the complexity of the contract. If there's a need for site visits, are there going to be any subcontracting arrangements that they need to get in place? If you take all those things into account, it may be that authority takes the view that actually 10 days is not enough, and that maybe the reduction doesn't carry the benefit that it might do. So while QPPN is potentially useful, maybe not as useful for reducing tender period as they are for, say, just informing the market and letting them know that the procurement opportunity is coming. And we've had a quick look on Find the Tender, and we found that there's over 500 PPNs at the moment. That's since February. What's not clear, though, are they used simply to warm up the market, or they're actually being used to reduce those tender timescales? What is certain, authorities are starting to use them, so it'll be interesting to see how it develops in the coming months. I'm going to hand back now to Jenny.
I can't hear Jenny. Can you?
Sorry, I was on mute there. So, yes, on this question, let's just imagine that we're coming up to the May 2026 deadline for next year's pipeline notice publication, and your plan as a team for one of your larger contracts is to implement an extension over 2 million using Section 74 of the Act, so one of those permitted modification extension grounds, including exercising an option, for example. So does that planned significant extension need to be included in your pipeline notice? So how do we go about answering that question? The first place I always start is to go back to the legislation. So let's look at the Act. And Section 93 says that the obligation to publish pipeline notices applies to a public contract with an estimated value of more than 2 million, in respect of which we expect to publish a tender or a transparency notice. So in other words, this is a contract where we're running a procurement process and we're publishing a tender notice, or we're making a direct award using one of the direct award grounds set out in Schedule 5, and we're publishing a transparency notice. And of course, if we're making a significant extension, we will be, or we ought to be, publishing a contract change notice in that regard. But this kind of notice doesn't fall within Section 93. So far, so good, that looks clear. I guess the reasoning is that the policy objective in pipeline notices is to provide sight to the market of procurement opportunities that it can expect to come up in the year. Having said that, we do have to tell markets about the direct awards that we're planning to make. And even though we know that this isn't going to be a procurement opportunity for the market, so here we're providing sight of large contracts where we're not going to be offering an open opportunity to compete. And if you start going off down that line of reasoning, then the making of an extension seems to be in the same kind of conceptual category, providing sight of large piece of expenditure which is not going to be made publicly available. And if you start looking at it in that way, you can see the argument that perhaps extensions should be included, particularly given that direct awards are. So if you then turn to the official Procurement Act 2023 guidance on pipelines, it does tell us that central government must follow the GCF commercial pipelines guidance. It also tells us that the purpose of a UK1 pipeline notice is to tell the market about our plans and expenditure for the reporting period ahead. And you can see that an extension could fall within that concept. After all, it is something that we are planning to spend significantly on. So given that at least central government has to comply with the commercial pipelines guidance, what does that say? And just an aside there, that we've seen NHS bodies as well as central government applying the guidance too. And I think there is a whole other talk there on the relationship between, for example, NHS trust and financial and foundation trusts and central government policy via PPNs and so on. To what extent does it apply? So while NHS trusts and foundation trusts are clearly central government authorities under the Act, it's less clear that PPNs and other central government guidance applies to them. But anyway, what does the GCF commercial principles guidance say about pipelines? So it's asking us for a forward look of prospective commercial activities. And when it tells us what those commercial activities are, extensions are expressly included. And that was quite a surprise to us when we first looked at it. However, when you read the guidance in a bit more depth, it does say that there is a distinction between internal pipelines as it sees them and external pipelines, so the publish of a UK1 pipeline notice. And towards the end of that guidance, there is an express statement that including extensions, although it could be best practice, is not a statutory requirement in an external UK1 pipeline notice. So I think as a result of that analysis and research, I think the answer is that there isn't a statutory requirement in the Act to include extensions, and there's no mandatory requirement in guidance to do so either. So if you're not including extensions, it would be hard for you to be challenged on that. But by all means, if as a matter of best practice you want to do that, you could feel free to do so. So that's the question of extensions. And just to remain on the topic of pipeline notices for a moment, and we just wanted to say something about the sort of contradictions and confusions which cropped up round about the end of May of this year, when the deadline for the publication of pipeline notices was reached and authorities were rushing to publish them. So what was the issue here? Well, if you look at Regulation 15 of the Procurement Regulations 2024, and those are the regulations that underpin the Act and set out what information needs to go into notices, that regulation says, this regulation sets out what information you've got to put in your pipeline notice. And the information is for each procurement set out in the pipeline notice, blah, blah, blah. And then there's a long list. So that very much implies that there's one pipeline notice and you cover each procurement, each contract within it. However, in April and May, we had a leaflet issued on pipeline notices and an update to the official guidance. And they very clearly stated that, okay, Regulation 15 does imply that the pipeline notice covers all of the relevant procurements and contracts. However, in practice, a pipeline notice will need to be published for each individual procurement in the pipeline. And this is so that subsequent notices about the procurement can be linked to those details. So I think what's happened is the way the central digital platform works is it actually needs an individual notice for each procurement in the pipeline list. And when you look at how many pipeline notices have it been published since the 24th of February, it's over 5,000. So it very much looks like most authorities have taken that approach. And I think in terms of planning for next year, given the way the final tender service seems to be working and the necessity of sort of linking the information in that way, I think that is going to continue to be the approach. So when you're planning for the May 2026 deadline, assume that we've got to do the same thing this next year as we did last year. And just as a thought, I suppose it's possible, because it's secondary legislation, that there could be an amendment to the Procurement Regulations 2024 so that it aligns more closely with the guidance and how it's actually going to work in practice. But anyway, that is enough on pipeline notices today, because we don't need to worry about them too much till next spring. Natalia is going to talk to us about preliminary market engagement. Thanks, Natalia.
Thanks very much, Jenny. Good morning, everyone. So we're talking about what is preliminary market engagement under the Act and what is it not. So if we just move on to the next slide, we're going to go straight into the Act, section 16. And what that talks about is it tells authorities that they may engage with suppliers and other persons for the following purposes. And the guidance refers to these as permitted purposes of PME, preliminary market engagement. So number one, developing the authority's requirements and approach to the procurement. So what could this look like? In practice, it's more around, if you're an authority, asking the market to fill in gaps in your knowledge. So, suppliers are the expert in the thing that you want to buy. You might want to ask them some questions about specification, for example. Alternatively, if it's the approach to the procurement, you might want to consult with the market in relation to the lotting structure of your process. That's one thing to think about. Next, designing a procedure, conditions of participation or award criteria. So in practice, I'm not seeing a lot of authorities engaging with suppliers asking for input on what criteria to use, but certainly in terms of designing a procedure, you might want to consult with the market to find out how negotiations should be phased, or at what stages of a process bidders might be able to complete certain cost models, for example. So there are lots of different things you could get input on from that. Thirdly, preparing the tender notice and associated tender documents. Now, I'm not seeing authorities really seeking input in terms of the tender notice, what we used to call the contract notice, but in terms of tender documents, I am seeing authorities sharing draft PSQs, so procurement questionnaires, and draft ITT documents and getting input from the market on those. And if that's something you want to do, you're perfectly allowed to do that as part of the permitted purposes. Secondly, identifying suppliers that may be able to supply the goods, services, or works required. This is a really big one for you as an authority. If, say, for example, you've had a contract which ran for 10 years, you're about to re-procure, it'd be really good to understand developments in suppliers on the market, to understand who's available, who may be emerging as a supplier, and you can get all that market intelligence from carrying out PME. Next, identifying likely contractual terms. Again, I'm seeing authorities sharing a draft contract maybe, or sharing excerpts of a contract, perhaps in relation to KPIs, which are big under the Act now. So that is one way that you could use that permitted purpose. And finally, building capacity among suppliers in relation to the contract being awarded. This, I think, would be really useful for SMEs. So if you're trying to share knowledge with certain suppliers in the market, getting them able to bid and facilitating that ability for them to bid. If you've got a really complicated financial model, for example, you might want to engage with the market and teach them a little bit about it ahead of your procurement. And alternatively, I'm actually seeing some authorities, because of the new Act and because of all the requirements for suppliers to sign on to the central digital platform, they're actually building capacity as part of market engagement by teaching suppliers about joining, logging on to find a tender and that kind of thing and uploading their information. So these are the permitted purposes of preliminary market engagement. There is one thing you take away from that, it's those definitions are super broad and preliminary market engagement covers so much. So that moves us on very nicely to our next slide, which is, we're called, where do you draw the line? So how do you know whether what you're doing is market engagement or not under the Act? It's important that you do know this because there are very important notice requirements in relation to this, which we'll deal with in question 5. So the key thing to think about is purpose and not format. So we've just talked about all the purposes. In terms of format, if you're an authority and say you're about to go out to tender, you do a bit of desktop research, you've identified maybe 2 or 3 suppliers who you'd really like to bid in your process, maybe you're even quite friendly with one of them and you pick up the phone to them and have a chat with them about what you're planning to do. You might say to me, and clients have said to me, Natalia, that's just informal, it's not market engagement. But no, it could count, probably does count. Informal discussions can count as market engagement, and that is because of this broad kind of octopus tentacles of the Procurement Act kind of seeping around everything and bringing everything that you're doing before you launch a procurement into that remit of the Act. So be very conscious there that those informal discussions could count. One way of figuring out if they do is asking yourself, are you giving suppliers an advantage? Are you giving them a heads up? And if you are, it's very likely that you're engaging in some kind of market engagement. And the Act is very clear about the consequences of an unfair advantage. So if you cannot avoid an unfair advantage to a supplier, the worst case scenario would be that you'd have to treat them as an excludable or excluded supplier. So they wouldn't be able to compete in the process. That's quite a serious consequence, something to be conscious of. So broadly, the way we're looking at it is, if there is some kind of exercise or interaction which is initiated by an authority, is authority-led, and it's in relation to a specific procurement, it's very likely to be preliminary market engagement or defined as that. If it's something which is supplier-led, so you're a supplier, you're sending a generic email to some of your customers and saying, we're having this trade show, we'd love to talk to you about our products, that's very much less likely to be preliminary market engagement. But of course, it will always be very fact-specific. If in doubt, our recommendation is presume that it is preliminary market engagement. And that takes us on to our next slide, which is, must you do PME? Must we? Let's find out. Move on to the next slide. In a nutshell, no. Strictly speaking, under the Act, it is not mandatory, but it is recommended. And our view is, any good procurement practitioner, even if you know your stuff, you know your market, you know your requirements, you probably would still be building in some time to carry out some form of market engagement because of the benefits that you could reap from that. Now, that moves us on to preliminary market engagement notices. So what is a PME notice? And remember, this is a new notice. We didn't have these kinds of notices before. We used to use old PIN notices in this way, but we never had a notice especially for PME. And a PME notice in the Act says that you intend to, or you have conducted preliminary market engagement. So if you've had those informal conversations, you can actually publish a notice after the event, which is really helpful and really useful to know. And it all goes to transparency, which is, of course, what the Act is trying to achieve. Now, if you carried out preliminary market engagement and you haven't published a notice, you then have to give reasons why not in your tender notice. The guidance, and the guidance here is actually really useful on preliminary market engagement, refers to acceptable reasons as being maybe where you had to keep the engagement secret for reasons of national security, or maybe where there were extenuating circumstances where you're in a huge hurry, and if you didn't rush, there'd be critical service failure. That's a high bar. So if you're carrying out market engagement and you're not publishing a PME notice, the reasons why that you put in the tender notice better be good according to what we're seeing under the guidance. And I would err on the side of caution here. Now, very quickly, what are the benefits of PME? I'm sure all of you are already aware of this, but just as a recap, for authorities, it's market intelligence. It's getting to know the market, getting to know what's out there, also positing yourself as the authority as a customer of choice. It's a really good opportunity to sell the authority, sell the opportunity and the prestige of that contract, for example. Secondly, for suppliers, it is a great opportunity for suppliers to contribute to influencing certain contract terms for the benefit of all parties and to de-risk poor performance. Now, Jenny spoke earlier about contract performance notices. And so if you are a supplier and you're conscious that you don't want to be caught out and exposed for poor performance, you could maybe use this period to talk to authorities about KPIs, talk about dispute resolution procedure, to influence the contract terms in that way. It's a really good way of being involved in the process. Very quickly, what level are we seeing PME notices going into? This is really varying. I'm seeing a lot of authorities publishing PME notices where they've already done all of their thinking, and actually what they're doing is they're just trying to warm the notice up. So they're saying, this is all the stuff we're doing, this is coming down the line. And that's sort of mixing up maybe with what they should be putting in a planned procurement notice potentially. So remember to use your PME notice to get information from the market and make it a two-way process. So that's PME in a nutshell. The overall recommendation is, if you're carrying out PME, which is recommended, make sure you act transparently, make sure you follow the notice requirements, and make sure that you ensure equal treatment. So thank you very much. I'll just hand back to Jenny.
Thank you, Natalia. That's really, really helpful and interesting. So we talked about all the P's today: planned procurement notices, pipeline notices, preliminary market engagement notices, and also an awful lot of PPNs. So it's definitely, I think, time for us to finish, to let you get on with your day. Do let us have your feedback if you're able. That a form should pop up at the end of the webinar. And as I said, the recording and the slides and a Q&A document will come around ASAP. We're next meeting on Thursday, the 6th of November, so just after the half-term holiday, and we hope that there'll be an update by then on the coming into force of the contract performance and the payments compliance notices obligations. But for now, just a big thank you. Hope you found it useful, and it's goodbye from Dominic, from Natalia, and from me, and have a lovely day. Thanks all. Bye.